And I'll be brief because I know my colleagues wish to join in this wonderful activity here to try and get good recognition. I join my colleague from North Dakota in strong support of a cause near and dear to my heart, the effort to add the names of the 74 sailors to the Vietnam War Memorial who perished in the training accident that sunk the USS Frank E. Evans in June of 1969. As my friend from North Dakota explained, the names of the 74 who died on the USS Frank Evans have been omitted because they died just outside the combat zone. But they had seen the heat of battle in Vietnam. The USS Frank Evans had been part of the Tet Offensive and was scheduled to return to the combat zone before sinking. That these men's lives ended in the tragedy of a training accident rather than in the line of fire makes no difference in the final analysis. They went off to war and laid down their lives in service of the country they loved. I was fortunate to know Larry Riley Sr. of Syracuse, New York, known to us as Chief Riley, who was serving on the Frank Evans alongside his son, Larry Riley Jr., on that fateful day in 1969. Larry Sr. survived that day. Jr. did not. And for the rest of his life, Chief Riley petitioned his country to give his son and his fellow shipmates the very least it could give to them, due recognition. I sat in Chief Riley's living room, and I've sat on Mary Ann Buettner's back porch and listened to her tell me all about her son, Terry Lee Henderson, who had also seen combat in Vietnam and who also died in that awful accident. Chief Riley passed away 2 years ago this month, but his cause does not die with him. These were living, breathing boys who lost their lives wearing the uniform of this great country. To inscribe their names on a memorial is but a small measure of peace for the families they left behind, the rightful act of a nation that recognizes the sacrifices of all its sons. I yield to my colleague from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
I'm here to add my voice to the eloquence of both Senators Cramer and Senator Schumer about the need to recognize those people who were lost on the Frank Evans. We had 2 sailors from New Hampshire who were lost that day. Ronald Arthur Thibodeau of Manchester, New Hampshire, joined the Navy in 1967, and he was assigned to the Frank E. Evans as radar man. Ron was on watch during the collision, and he was lost at sea, leaving behind a young son. And Gary Joseph Vigue of Farmington, New Hampshire, was also on watch that night during the fatal collision. Gary had married his high school sweetheart a few weeks before he reported to the Frank Evans in 1968. Gary also left behind a young son and his 2 brothers who still live in New Hampshire. These 2 men, Gary and Ron, gave their lives for this country. These men were supporting operations during the Vietnam War, and they were planning to return to Vietnam waters once the training exercise was over. So just like all those other people who were lost in Vietnam, they gave their lives for this country. And just because they were outside some artificially designated combat zone doesn't mean they shouldn't be recognized in the same way that the others who were lost in Vietnam have been recognized. You know, Madam President, this is May, the month of May. Memorial Day is approaching, a day during which our nation honors the men and women who have died while serving in the U.S. military. And as we recognize the sacrifices of our fellow Americans, I think it's appropriate that the Senate take up and pass the USS Frank E. Evans Act, legislation that I'm really honored to co-sponsor with my colleague, Senator Cramer from North Dakota, because it's legislation that will ensure the 74 men, those lost 74, are rightfully honored by adding their names to the Vietnam War Memorial. I urge my colleagues to support this measure. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Cramer, for this effort to ensure that the lost 74 are recognized.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Madam President, whether North Dakotans, Granite Staters, or New Yorkers, these stories are very moving. And when I first heard from Mr. Grant's family, I was a member of the House of Representatives. And I looked into his request and introduced an amendment to the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act to inscribe the names of the lost 74. While the measure unanimously passed the House, it was blocked here in the Senate. So when I came to the Senate last year, introducing this legislation was one of my very first actions and high priorities. And it had some success. We have 20 co-sponsors, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats, including the chairman and the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee that has jurisdiction. When members from Montana to Maine, North Dakota to New Hampshire, and New York can come together on an issue as important as honoring the fallen sailors, I would hope this would garner some attention, and it has. It has. Last summer, the Frankie Evans Act received its first ever hearing before a Senate Energy Subcommittee. I thank the chairman and my colleague from Alaska for providing the opportunity for the story of these sailors to be heard. It was there when I first heard opposition to the bill, however. Madam President, I've yet to hear any real opposition to the legislation voiced by anyone except the bureaucrats and special interests who would actually have to be charged with carrying it out. In other words, nobody objects to this except the people that would have to do something about it. And that's a common theme in this town, I've noticed. For example, the acting director of the National Park Service said of the bill, if passed, now imagine this is a quote, if passed, it would necessitate substantial modification of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall as it exists today. No kidding. Of course it does. That's the point of the bill. The idea that we should continue to turn a blind eye to forgotten veterans because the work would be substantial is offensive. It's certainly offensive to the shipmates and the families and the survivors of the last 74. So forgive my lack of sympathy for bureaucrats who feel inconvenienced by the death of 74 war heroes. The country that landed a man on the moon the very same year that this accident happened certainly can figure out how to fix a wall to honor these war dead. More to the point, Madam President, shouldn't we be looking for more ways to honor our fallen rather than fewer? The opposition's argument simply does not add up. Since the wall was built, hundreds of names have been added, and more work still needs to be done. According to the Washington Post, one soldier was etched 3 times. 13 soldiers had their name etched twice. And while the wall bears 58,390 names, they represent 58,276 different people. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, which is responsible for the wall, conducted a study which showed flaws exist with names etched in the memorial. To think we'd not add the names of the last 74 when we know corrections already need to be made seems counterintuitive, if not downright lazy. Yet despite all this, despite the veterans being forgotten, despite this legislation being sent here twice by the House, despite a successful hearing on the bill, progress in the Senate has stalled. And that's why, Madam President, my colleagues and I have asked the Department of Defense to address this issue as well. The department has a mixed, if not negative, record with this issue. You know, they tell you what you want to hear till you go away and hope you never come back. Yet, similar to this body, we've been met with complete silence. Not a yes, not a no, not a maybe, not a suggestion to make the proposal better. We find their silence unacceptable. Therefore, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to pass the Frankie Evans Act. The last 74, their loved ones and their shipmates have waited long enough. No matter how it can be spun, the choice before this chamber is whether to give these veterans the recognition they deserve or to stand in their way. So, Madam President, with that, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Energy be discharged from further consideration of S-849 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.